Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 9th Annual Great Agri-Food Debate, a joint venture between Dawn Meats and McDonald's, who are proud to support the next generation of business leaders in UK and Ireland. My name is Paul Nolan. I'm Group Development Manager with Dawn Meats, and I'm in charge of proceedings for this afternoon. So you're very welcome, and thanks to all involved in making this a possibility this afternoon. Our topic for this debate today is a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. And to debate this, we have proposing the motion University College Cork, captained by Albie Dunn, and opposing the motion are the team from Harper Adams in the UK, captained by Llewellyn Evans. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Albie Dunn from UCC, proposing the motion, to make the captain's opening remarks. Over to you, Albie.
Honourable adjudicators, chairpersons, and esteemed members of the opposition, fellow debaters, good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to join us here today while we discuss our motion. My name is Albie Dunn, and I am delighted to be this year's captain for University College Cork's Great Agri-Food Debate team. I stand before you today to articulate why we firmly and wholeheartedly believe that a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. Let's go right back and discuss the meaning of the motion. It's crafted to achieve a long-term or overarching goal. Imagine a world where no one goes to bed hungry, where not just fields and forests are supported, but entire communities. We stand at a critical crossroads in human history, one where the choices we make today will shape not only our own future, but that of every farmer, scientist, business, and consumer worldwide. It is an urgent and vital moment for a global strategy that is effective, inclusive, and actionable to be brought about. This is more than just an abstract ideal. It is a call to action. We face a monumental challenge, ensuring that every person on Earth has consistent access to nutritious, high-quality food. To do this, we cannot relate and rely on just isolated efforts alone. We need a unified cross-border approach that respects regional practices while fostering international cooperation. In 2020, nearly 3.1 billion people were unable to afford a healthy diet, which implies an increase of 112 million more than 2019. This increase has been mostly driven by Asia, where 78 million more people in 2020 could not afford a healthy diet, followed by Africa with 25 million more people, Latin America and the Caribbean with 8 million more people, and Northern America and Europe with 1 million more people. The question is clear, urgent, and impossible to ignore. Can we, as a global community, rise to this occasion and commit to ensuring that no one is left behind? We must shield not only developing countries, but everyone. As climate change intensifies and population growth surges, the world's food systems are at a breaking point. We cannot afford to falter. If we have the knowledge, technology, and resources to feed the world, why are millions still going hungry every day? To prevent widespread food insecurity and a potential global food crisis, we must adopt a strategy rooted in innovation. The WHO Global Strategy for Food Safety 2022 to 2030 was adopted by the 75th World Health Assembly in 2022. The updated strategy addresses current and emerging challenges, incorporates new technologies, and includes innovative approaches for strengthening food safety systems. This approach must integrate resilient practices, accelerate research in sustainable agriculture, and empower communities to increase yields without compromising environmental health. Together, we must create a food system that safeguards against crisis, where every harvest sustains not just individuals, but the entire planet. The European Union, ensuring global food strategy security, assesses how to improve cooperation between the public and private sectors and evaluate risks when crises arise. Every voice and every action matters in this mission to secure our food future. This is not a matter of progress, but a matter of survival. In today's interconnected global ecosystem, the evidence is clear. It is both a moral obligation and a strategic necessity that no country turns a blind eye while others face catastrophe. resources, and powerful communication networks. With these, we have the tools to swiftly detect emerging crises and deploy targeted aid. Food security in one region affects the rest of the world, driving fluctuations in market prices, threatening supply chains, and impacting social cohesion. A powerful example of this is Croppen's collaboration with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Centre. Together, they are equipping more than 3,200 farmers across Bangladesh and Sri Lanka with tools to implement climate-resilient methods and proactively manage climate-related risks. Acting together to pool resources, whether technological, financial, or intellectual, it is essential to creating proactive solutions that prevent hunger before it takes root. It is a strategic investment in global stability, prosperity, and the shared future of all nations. Thank you.
So thank you, Elby, for the opening remarks on behalf of UCC. And now we'll have the opening remarks from Llewellyn Evans, whose team is opposing the motion, a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. Over to you.
Judges, moderators, and our esteemed opposition. I'm Llewellyn Evans, and I'm privileged to be the Harper Adams captain for this debate. This debate in which we will oppose the very idea that a singular global food strategy can be employed to avoid famine and climate catastrophe. We're not suggesting that the avoidance of famine and climate catastrophe is not a priority or should not be a priority within this century, but simply that a global food strategy is impractical, inappropriate, and purely treats the symptoms and not the causes, especially on a theoretical and not practical front. This is evident with the primary causation of famine, with the World Food Programme identifying climatic conditions in 2 of the 5 countries enduring the risk of famine, with conflict being a factor within all 5. Furthermore, they clearly state that conflict and the associated challenges of access is the primary cause in all 5. Furthermore, with the Collins Dictionary identifying the climate as general weather and a catastrophe as an unexpected event, it is easily recognizable that unexpected weather is out of the control of any one nation or any collaboration of nations. And furthermore, the idea that we can predict in order to avoid climate catastrophe is hopeful at best. On top of this, any notion that a global food strategy can be utilized to reduce the impact that food production and food consumption has on climate change and the frequency of climate catastrophe must be challenged, not purely through the question of effectiveness, but also via the question of practicality of implementation. We believe firmly that what is being discussed and what's being proposed is theoretical as opposed to practical, and bases itself upon the idea of an ideal world in which nations collaborate for the good of each other and for the good of humankind. However, we recognise and we firmly believe this is not practical, it is not plausible, and it will not solve the issues that we are being faced. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you to Llewellyn for the opening remarks in opposing a global strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophe in this century. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our judges, Gareth, Nick, and Sarah. Perhaps, Gareth, you might introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Gareth McGee. I work for Bank of Ireland, primarily in the food and agri sector. So lending to all the large companies from both a UK and Irish perspective, and therefore, I suppose, helping to support the economy and the sector grow going forward.
Thank you very much. Nick, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Allen. I'm Chief Executive of the British Meat Processors Association. We're a trade association that represents all the large meat processors in the UK. And in fact, many of our members are based in the Republic of Ireland as well. And our members mainly supply the mainstream supermarkets and food service sector, as well as taking part in a lot of export activity.
Thank you very much, Nick. And Sarah?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so I'm Sarah Hare, Head of Agriculture for the Dawn Meats McDonald Group, looking after all our farmer relationships and dealing with all our customers across the board. So really looking forward to hearing the rest of this debate. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Sarah. And I'm sure you've already heard my colleague Eileen there, who will step in on timekeeping to say time at 4 minutes and time up at 5 minutes. So we've heard from our opening remarks from our captains. Thank you very much. We now move on to the speakers, and after each speaker, there will be the opportunity for the opposition to make a point of information. If you do, we ask you to make it precise and to the point. And after the point of information has been answered, we will take a 2-minute break to allow judges to do their scoring and then go to the next speaker, etc. So without further ado, it is my pleasure now to introduce George Hemming, representing Harper Adams, who is speaking in opposition to the motion, a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. So over to you, George.
Thank you. We start here opposing this global strategy, which we believe is based off an ideology and a principle centered around that. How does it come into manage conflict, logistics, the constraints of a war-torn nation, which represents so much of our globe? How does your policy, your proposal, align with these values? We don't think it does. We oppose this. The strategy, Southampton University state 40% of the world's nations are exposed to conflict. The UN backs us up even further, saying that through all this global food crisis, 309 million people are facing acute hunger. And this is predominantly focused in areas such as the Gaza Strip, South Sudan, Mali and Somalia, places which are deprived, full of people who don't have the investment and levels of technology. But how can this be resolved? Yes, there are the opportunities to develop. But for example, the Gaza Strip, 1.1 people are at imminent risk of famine, and half the Gaza Strip a catastrophic risk of food insecurity. According to the Integrated Food Security Classification, how can this threat be treated? How do you propose that this singular plan will work within a scenario such as the Gaza Strip, Somalia? Yes, this could all be linked together and proposed as a more similar ideology, but then that's a less evolved nation. Then we move to places like Ukraine, which are producing some of the greatest volumes of wheat and oilseed rape soy. A very evolved and developed nation, yet attacked by another involved nation. How has their government gone about food security, and how have they listened to a global food strategy such as this? And they've, from an economic perspective, after the invasion, they lost 30 to 35% of their GDP. This had a major effect on their ability to reinvest, to keep going. How do you fight a war yet feed your country? And this is what I think the proposal lacked. It lacked the clarity to relate it to, scenarios which are present in this globe. That country will need to, for example, they cut taxes by 18%, VAT was reduced, abolished all import duties and fuel duties to try and keep the country moving. Yes, there is the argument that this, kept the nation going, but where does your strategy, where does your plan? It seems very much focused at the here and now, not the there and then. How will this evolve and take this nation forwards back to this ideological principle, which it seems to evolve around? Instead, what was a developed nation and the effect that this has had in reducing the fact that, global security, food security has been lost or at risk from this proposal. And the idea is we think there's a lack of clarity behind what you've put forward. So we'd like to, we don't think this is fit because it does not represent evolved and less evolved nations. It does not represent conflict, and it does not represent what vast proportions of our global population face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And I would ask if there's a point of information from UCC, please.
Point of information. In Raquel Guinea's 2024 paper on the challenges and strategies of food security under global change, she clearly outlines that a global food strategy is critical to mitigate the effects of conflict for food security, to stabilize supplies, and in localized conflicts like in Gaza as they prolong. This is what is clearly being shown to be needed.
George, do you care to reply to that?
I'm going 5 seconds. It's on what you've just pointed out there is that yes, there is evidence to state this, but you have not stated this yourselves. I think you can't group. What we're trying to say is you cannot group an individual. You have to look at it back to circumstances and back to each sort of nation and their response and their ability. And I think it doesn't hark back to just the conflict, but it's that economic impact, it's that infrastructure, it's how does this all interrelate, and where do we, produce a plan and a response from this going forwards? Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. So it is now my pleasure to ask Laura Jennings to come forward to speak, proposing the motion a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. So over to you, Lauren.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges, chairpersons, and members of the opposing team. My name is Lauren Jennings, and I am here with you today to discuss the crucial role of agriculture in preventing famine and combating climate change. Agriculture plays a key role in shaping global food strategies aimed at preventing famine and mitigating climate change. As my colleague Alva previously mentioned, the way that we produce, distribute, and consume food has direct implications for food security, poverty reduction, and environmental sustainability. The world population today is double that of 48 years ago. This is a staggering figure, and as such, the agricultural sector must evolve to meet the complex demands of feeding the world today, not the world 48 years ago, whilst also minimizing its environmental impact. I fully believe that this can be achieved with a global strategy that unites world leaders in the agri-food sector. So how do we do this? It is under no dispute that agriculture is at the heart of global food security. Who will rear the animals, grow the crops, and produce the food you need to feed your children without the very people who have been farming the land for centuries? Many of the world's most food insecure populations are smallholder farmers. A case study carried out by the Government of Ireland Food Vision for 2030 shows that family farms occupy 70 to 80% of farmland worldwide. Global policies that provide financial support, market access, and capacity building can help these farmers adopt climate resilient practices, which can increase their productivity and improve their income, contributing to broader food security. This can help smaller communities be more resilient to global food supply chain disruptions. On top of this, ensuring that all farmers, especially in developing regions, have equal access to land, water, and financial services is critical to improving food security. This can only be achieved with a global strategy in place to ensure that, in the words of Percy Shelley, the rich are not getting richer and the poor are not getting poorer. Everyone should have access to food, not just the people with the resources to grow it. 44% of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. That's around 5 times the size of the United States. That sounds like it should be enough land to feed a global population, right? Then why are people still going hungry? Clearly, something isn't working. Less than 30% of food globally never makes it into a mouth. Strengthening global trade systems while ensuring fair trade principles can help improve access to food, particularly in regions vulnerable to food insecurity. Unfortunately, agricultural activities do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and land degradation. However, they are not the enemy, and we should not treat them as such. Do not bite the hand that feeds you. Agriculture actually has the potential to be a part of the solution by adopting practices that reduce emissions and promote carbon sequestration, such as agricultural technology like drought-resistant crops, agroecology, and crop rotation to improve soil health. Ag-Climatize sets a vision for a climate-neutral agricultural sector in Ireland by 2050. This is the forward thinking we need to be implementing on a global scale. It is evident that the impact of agriculture on global food strategies is vast and multifaceted. To prevent famine and mitigate climate change, agricultural systems must evolve to be more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. This involves rethinking how we produce food, adopting climate-smart agricultural practices, and strengthening policies to support food security. Ultimately, the challenge is not only to produce enough food for a growing global population, but also to ensure that food is produced in a way that safeguards the planet and the producers for future generations. If we work together, we grow together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Lauren. And I would like to invite Harper Adams with a point of information, if they have one, please.
Hello. My point of interest is you're talking about climate resilient farming. How can those displaced by conflict farm? And how would a climate focused farming provide food for those who are displaced and within a conflict zone?
This is exactly why we need a global strategy, so that we can provide resources to people in areas of conflict and help them to be able to grow crops that can be grown in their areas as well, and provide them with financial support and aid so that they are not forgotten about and that they too have access to food. Thank you.
And so now I'm delighted to invite Ollie Glover, representing Harper Adams, to oppose the motion. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'd first like to visit the point of how production can be increased while also attempting to build in sustainable agricultural practices, where commonly what we're seeing, especially in the UK with countryside stewardship, sustainable farming incentives, the government is using their food strategy to ask farmers to take land out of production in order to favour the environment and biodiversity in the UK, which is important. However, in 2024, we're seeing the largest amount of unfarmed acreage in the UK in recorded history. And so especially when agriculture in the UK is not the leading cause of pollution, why should we be jeopardizing our own production in order to feed the rest of the globe when famine is occurring across the globe? I'd also like to say that the world and the global supply chain is so naturally nuanced and varied. Making decisions in The Hague or New York, it risks generalizing how cultures across the world feed themselves, farm in typically more sustainable ways than we do in developed countries, and also risks homogenizing cultures in the process and cultural staple foods, which are not eaten across the globe. As well as that, we've seen from the size of the global supply chain, regardless, that is with size, it's also grown in fragility. With Russia invading Ukraine and grain held in the ports in the Black Sea, it had huge effects on the availability of grain for Africa and many dependent countries across the world, and skyrocketed prices. When countries should be developing their own food strategies, I don't think that it is sustainable in terms of the fragility that it introduces to look at it across the whole globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ollie. So I just ask the opposition team, if you have a point of information for Ollie, please, UCC.
You said at the beginning that you should focus more on your own country and growing your own crops. Why should you have to supply a global food chain? Do you expect people in other countries to just starve if they don't have the resources to feed themselves?
Time.
Thank you.
No, but first and foremost, we need to make sure that there's enough food to support the entire globe. And I think countries which are particularly able, such as the UK, should be focusing on production and not sustainable agriculture, which takes land out of production. It's exactly why more land should be in production, so there's enough to feed the UK and export to the world.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Well answered. And so I'm delighted now to ask Sarah King to debate on behalf of UCC in proposing the motion. Sarah, over to you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, adjudicators, esteemed guests, fellow debaters, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending today. My name is Sarah King, and my group and I propose that a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. I am here to discuss how a global food strategy could help improve health and nutrition worldwide and establish food equity. Food production has consistently been increasing across the centuries, and according to the FAO, global food production currently exceeds 2,750 calories per person per day, indicating that there are adequate calories to feed the world. Yet in 2020, there was a staggering 2.37 billion people, nearly 1/3 of the global population, who did not have access to sufficient food. And if that wasn't shocking enough for you, 1/5 of the food available for consumption goes to waste. There is an enormous discrepancy here. A global food strategy could ensure equal food distribution, reduced food waste, and thus address world hunger, but also diet-associated diseases such as malnutrition and obesity. But not only this, a global food strategy would ensure the correct types and amounts of food are produced. Currently, there are adequate calories to feed the world population, but not the correct quantity of each food type. For example, the world is overproducing grains, fats, and sugars, all while largely underproducing fruits and vegetables, and to a reduced extent, proteins. A global food strategy could put measures in place to create the correct balance. For example, through subsidising farmers, providing grants and resources, as well as guidance and networks. Food is produced globally and distributed globally, so why not introduce a global food strategy? A global food strategy could ensure equal access and distribution of food. Rules and regulations could be implemented regarding food fortification. For example, ensuring nutritional requirements are met, as well as sustainable food production practices, so we are not contributing to climate change. The challenge the world faces is food production keeping up with demand as the population grows exponentially. There must be policies introduced to ensure there is sufficient food, while at the same time not depleting natural resources. Let me ask you this: did you feel the need to tighten your belt when the war broke out in Ukraine? Everybody is affected, but not to the same extent. When the war broke out, the Food Price Index from the FAO, which tracks the monthly variations of the price of a basket of common food commodities, showed that in March 2022, the prices were 33.6% higher than the previous March. A coordinated plan with the cooperation of governments, multinational corporations, financial institutions, and individuals is the only way to solve these problems. We require diplomatic and political solutions to mend relations and develop peace. Climate change has a direct negative impact on food security due to lower crop yields and failed crops. Many of you may not know that in 2021, Madagascar was on the verge of the world's first climate change-induced famine due to severe drought, according to the UN. A global food strategy is imperative to creating invaluable links and networks between rural producers and global markets, creating prosperity and empowering producers. Policies must be coordinated to prevent food shortage, stockpile resources, and ensure distribution, especially in emergencies like climate catastrophes. Fair trade is an example of an amazing initiative that I am certain everyone here today has heard of, involving many global stakeholders and an example of a global food strategy that has had far-reaching positive impacts in reducing hunger, introducing sustainable practices, and bringing economic stability to impoverished regions. And we can take a lot of learnings from this. A systemic approach needs to be adopted to production and distribution. Absolutely no one can argue that a global food crisis does not require a global food strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And we'll ask Harper Adams for a point of information if they have one.
Thanks very much. You mentioned that the key to this would be to improve the distribution of the food produced under this policy. Who do you expect to pay for the improved connections for the food route? Because it can't be the impoverished regions, and if it's not them, then who does it?
Yes, can't be the impoverished regions, but they need to be supported by the first world countries. So they do. Like there's a broad consensus for a global strategy to improve global support, meaning that we need finance from financial institutions, the multinational companies, governments, to distribute the wealth among all nations to provide food equity and distribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So, ladies and gentlemen, our debate is absolutely flying along. We're now at the point of hearing from the last of the speakers for both camps. And firstly, I'm going to ask Sam Wren from Harper Adams to give his points on opposing the motion that global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophe in this century. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, everyone, for all your time today. So let's start with the point. A global food strategy is not the answer or the solution to climate change within agriculture. Agriculture isn't even in the top 3 producers of carbon emissions in the world. Energy and transport are by far the largest 2 emitters of greenhouse gases, with a combined carbon output of around 22.5 billion tonnes, which is compared to agriculture, which is at 5.8 billion tonnes. And the other problem with this strategy I can't get my head around is the definition of sustainability. Are you trying to sustain food production for all over the entire globe, or are you trying to be more environmentally sustainable? Because you can't have both. And the reason why you can't have both is because how can we produce? You've got crop rotations and cover crops. They will only go so far to reducing your need for artificial fertilizers. But when you're reducing land because of schemes such as carbon capture, reducing carbon emissions, there's too much competition for land now where it's just you need to push your yields more. So more artificial fertilizer, more tractors on your ground, which means you're going to tire the ground out far, far quicker. And 8.2 billion people is not a small number to feed by any means. And it's something that I think will have to be considered within the global food strategy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. And do we have a point of information from UCC, please?
Yes, my point of information focuses on the fact that you completely ignore famine as part of this debate. Famine and climate, food production and sustainability, whilst conflicting issues, you can't ignore one at the expense of the other. They are inextricably linked, and it's not all about reducing acreage. For example, the 1 acre fund, the sustainable practices in African smallholder farms to increase yields and income, suggesting that global strategies can support and amplify local innovations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
So climate change and famine aren't directly linked, and they shouldn't be, because we could feed the world unsustainably 8.2 billion people using loads and loads of artificial fertilizers on our ground. But when you bring in the factor climate change, it creates the whole challenge a lot more difficult, and that keeping your carbon emissions down and ensuring soil erosion is kept to a minimum will determine whether you could stop the world from going famine for a lot longer. Thank you.
Thanks a million. And so to our last speaker before the captains make their closing remarks, I invite Lucas Jankowski to speak on behalf of UCC proposing the motion. Over to you, Lucas.
Hello, judges, moderators, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lucas Jankowski. I rise to explain why a global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. There are many challenges that lie ahead in global food security and climate. Meeting the food and nutritional needs of growing urban and rural populations, increasing sustainable agricultural production, enhancing resilience to climate change, finding sustainable solutions to the increasing competition for natural resources, increasing intensity and incidence of meteorological phenomena. These will not impact a single country or region, rather us as a world, which highlights the importance of a global food strategy. We need one that will serve as the new standard. The ultimate purpose being to promote resilient, achievable, sustainable work towards food security, and hence preventing both famine and climate catastrophes in this century. We need global cooperation. Different countries will have varying agendas and priorities. This is why it is crucial that we consider the needs of all, as opposed to consulting with only a minority. A global food strategy can only work once all parties have clearly expressed their ambitions. We need diversity. Globalization of a $9 trillion food industry has come with immense benefits, namely stabilizing global food chains. Multiple supply sources can now be used, making produce cheaper and more accessible to consumers. Not to mention the economic growth and employment that the industry maintains. A prime example is Vietnam and its rice export, amounting to 6 million tons, or $3 billion in 2023. Employing some 8 million people in rural areas and promoting investment into public utilities, as per the World Bank. Nonetheless, it has also brought drawbacks. According to a 2022 European Commission article, transporting produce internationally is responsible for 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We also see export-dependent economies, resulting in local produce price spikes, hindering access to quality diets. The point is not to move away from globalization, rather to address these shortcomings by a global strategy. Globalization of the food industry is the way ahead, particularly given our growing population and increasing environmental constraints. Today's global food strategy is to be a product of social, environmental, and economical factors. Social, because food is a right as per the UN Basic Human Needs. Environmental, because we depend on land, water, air for agriculture and cattle. Economical, because costs are a natural product of global trade. A strong strategy must encompass the production, processing, and distribution of produce. Economic, social, and environmental disparities within and across countries are impacting the effectiveness of both national and global food systems. As per a 2018 World Health Organization report, 70% of Ethiopia's population relies on sustainable farming. Recurrent droughts are destroying crop yields and livestock. 20 million people are food insecure. We stand by a strategy that can be gradually implemented through its adaptability, regardless of a country's context. It must act as guidelines and recommendations for catalyzing coherent global action. Regional and country levels must all be the stakeholders to combat famine and climate catastrophes. An exemplar case of a global food strategy is the Codex Alimentarius developed by the World Health and Food Organizations, still in use today by nearly 190 countries worldwide. It has and continues to enhance food safety, quality, and global trade. Thank you.
Well done, Lucas. Thank you very much. Do we have a point of information for Lucas from Harper Adams, please?
Hello. We do not dispute the requirement in order to limit famine. We simply just ask, how will your strategy circumvent the geopolitical situations that we are facing in the world, as seen in Ukraine, as seen in Russia? How will this cooperation reside alongside the existing challenges that we face? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Lucas?
Very good point. We need global cooperation, and this is evident through food aid, which has been delivered by the UN FAO, for example, in Somalia. I'm sure you're all very aware that in Somalia, it is currently, and has been for a relatively long time, a zone of conflict. 80% of the population in Somalia lives under the poverty line. And the food aid is a result of global cooperation. And in order to achieve global cooperation, that means we've had to reunite many nations, notably first world nations, to cooperate and create an effective strategy.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And so, judges, you've heard from Captain Llewellyn and his teammates from Harper Adams, George, Ollie and Sam, proposing the motion that global food strategy is the way to avoid both famine and climate catastrophe in this century. So I now ask Llewellyn to make his captain's closing remarks, please.
Brilliant. Hello. Judges, moderator, our most esteemed opposition. I have to simply say that no theory can be practically implemented as a whole. No strategy can avoid the requirements for operational planning. The basis for your argument is baseless. There is no solution to the challenges we face. There is simply just a question of how. There's no identification on how we are to avoid famine and climate catastrophe, just a recognition that it should be avoided. Without recognition, we completely agree. We simply ask how. It is clear to us that there are two nations, Ireland and the UK, or collaboration of nations, I should say, for the UK, are merely miles apart. Our agricultural practices vary to meet the requirements of our unique supply chains. The very notion that we can, with effectiveness and clarity and efficiency, introduce a common agricultural system, a common agricultural incentive, is vague and insensitive to the requirements of each market and the requirements of each nation. It fails to recognize our mistakes of the past. Furthermore, how can we be sure that our investment will be returned through self-efficiency? Provision. We ask who will pay, how will they pay, who will teach, and who will protect the right to produce, who will protect the right to learn. Afghanistan finds itself within a famine after 2 decades of investment, financial investment, educational investment, physical investment, with countless lives put at risk and lost. And I ask you now, only a day after we pause to remember those lives, how will your strategy differ from the past? How will the results differ? How will your theoretical strategy differ from those that are in place now? How? Furthermore, You state that famine and climate is inextricably linked. We disagree. Palestine was not a drawing of famine prior to the conflict, regardless of the climate. Yet within a space of a year, a displaced populace is hungry. And you blame climate change. We have constantly asked how a global food strategy deals with conflict. You have failed to identify a solution to famine. How do we access conflict zones? Through roads that are bombed, with a threat of drones overhead. Drones that do not identify aid from armed. Do we access through the front line of terrorist factions, I ask you? And how do we produce in these zones? Should a farmer face death rather than be displaced? Who will demine the barley fields? Who will separate the shrapnel from the silage? We do not dispute the requirements. We simply ask how, and we still stand here asking how. We still ask how. It must be understood that what is being proposed is a strategy to predict the unpredictable, to rationalise the irrational and be implemented for 8.1 billion people for the remainder of this century, for all people. And simply we ask how. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Well, and certainly you've left us in no doubt there about your opposition to the motion. So can I now call finally on team captain from UCC, Avi Dunn, to propose for the last time in her closing remarks.
Honourable adjudicators, esteemed opposition and fellow debaters, as we draw this debate to a close, I want to leave you with an undeniable truth. A global food strategy is not a choice, but an urgent necessity. We live in a world where global food production exceeds the needed calories per person per day, and yet over 700 million people are still undernourished. This is because the distribution of food is broken, fragmented by inequalities, political challenges, and logistical failures. Without a global strategy to address these issues, we cannot hope to solve the growing crises of hunger, malnutrition, and environmental degradation. Furthermore, global cooperation is not a mere ideal. It is a practical solution. The rise of nationalism, trade protectionism, and geopolitical tensions have only exacerbated food insecurity. What we witnessed with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where food supplies were disrupted, prices soared, and entire populations were left hungry. This is a stark reminder of how interconnected our food system is globally. Given that conflict and climate change and droughts and floods, etc., does not stop at borders, why should a beneficial strategy? Wouldn't a coordinated global approach help us better to respond to these challenges? The consequences of inaction will be catastrophic, not just for the millions already suffering, but for future generations who will face the compounded crises of climate collapse and food instability. If we continue to ignore the need for a unified approach, we risk further deepening inequalities in our food systems, jeopardizing not just our food security, but the very stability of our planet. We know that climate change is a global issue, one that transcends national borders and impacts every corner of the earth. Its effects on agriculture are undeniable. Shifting crop yields, extreme weather events, and increasingly volatile growing conditions are threatening food security on an unprecedented scale. The science is clear. A local action alone is insufficient. A coordinated global approach is essential to mitigate the devastating impacts of climate change on our food systems. By establishing universal standards for climate resilience, we create a framework for collaboration that ensures all nations, regardless of their size or wealth, are equipped to face threats posed by a changing climate. A major issue has been the disconnect between international support and national needs. Often, donor-driven programs are not sufficiently aligned with the priorities of the recipient countries. This requires a country-led approach where national governments are in the driver's seat, but supported by international partners who bring resources, knowledge, and expertise. The REACH Ending Child Hunger and Undernutrition initiative is an excellent example of how global cooperation can make a tangible impact on food security. REACH has scaled up tailored nutrition activities in Bangladesh, focusing on mothers and children, some of the most vulnerable populations. An interagency consortium involving the FAO, WHO, UNICEF, WFP, and many others. REACH strengthens local capacity by providing diagnostic tools and coordinating stakeholders, also enhancing decision-making for the nutrition policy and programme implementation. This multi-sectoral collaborative approach integrates food and nutrition security policies with actionable, locally adapted interventions, demonstrating how a unified global strategy can address malnutrition and food insecurity at ground level. Several significant global commitments, such as the First Rome Principle, the 2009 Joint Statement, and the Paris Declaration, have laid foundation for international collaboration on food security. By ensuring that support is tailored to the specific needs of each country, this will ensure more effective, impactful, and sustainable outcomes. In conclusion, a unified global strategy is essential to prevent famine and catastrophic food insecurity in this century. Climate change, economic instability, and unequal food distribution demand a coordinated approach. Only through global cooperation, cross-sectional collaboration, and sustained funding can we build resilient food systems. Without such a strategy, we risk challenges that already threaten millions. The time for a comprehensive, unified approach is now. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Elve. That brings the proceedings to a close. And thank you for an outstanding performance from both teams. Okay, it looks like, guys, we have results in. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to announce that for debate 2, the speaker award goes to Sarah King from UCC. Well done, Sarah. And the overall winner of today's debate is indeed UCC. Okay, so look, that leaves it just for me to thank everybody for participating today. My condolences to Harper Adams. You put on a great show. It was a very tight, obviously, competition given how long it took us to get a result. And we would welcome you to tune in to us in Waterford on November 28th. And thank you so much for participating. And we look forward to see you back to fight again next year. So to everybody involved, to our technical staff, to Eileen on time, to Dawn on scorekeeping, and of course to Cynthia for keeping the show on the road, to you, our judges, and to our sponsors, Dawn and McDonald's. Thank you to everybody, and see you in the next movie. Thank you. Bye-bye.